Welcome to our final summer 2021 Creative Escape seminar with Dr. Roxanne Zaskovich, Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice, College of Liberal Arts, and Dr. Neil Matheson, Department of English, College of Liberal Arts, with the topic Forensic Science, Fact, and Fiction. I am Dr. Ann Cavallo, Assistant Vice Provost and Director of the Center for Research on Teaching and Learning Excellence, here with Dr. Andrew Clark, Associate Director, and we are happy that you're here to share in this event. Here's the agenda for today. We are starting with introductions, so welcome, and then faculty presentations. We'll get started right away with Dr. Zaskovich. Her title is Forensic Science, Uncovering the Facts. Then after Dr. Zaskovich, Dr. Neil Matheson will present Incriminating Traces, Forensic Science in Detective Fiction. After the presentations, we will have questions and discussion, and then contact us information for you. And we won't have a next event, but we would talk about what we might do next summer and close out then. Now for questions, please put your questions in the chat. You won't be able to call out questions. We'll read them out to the presenters during the question and discussion time. So please do use your chat box to write in your questions, and we'll be sure to share them with the presenters during the question and discussion time. With that, I welcome you again, and I will turn this over to Dr. Zaskovich.
How are we doing today? I'm going to talk to you about the facts of forensic science here today. We're just going to do a little bit of an overview of the history of forensic science and kind of some of the major highlights. And then I really kind of want to focus on something that is happening today and now in the field that's really exciting and impacts all of us. And then I'm going to end it with a little bit of an introduction on what the fictional side of things is doing to the field of forensic science, so that we can transition into that conversation about fiction in forensic science as well. So these are the things we're going to talk about: the history, that new wave, and then this influence of fiction on the field of forensic science here today. So first of all, we should start always with knowing what we're talking about. And so just very briefly, science in general is this body of physical, biological, or even social or cultural knowledge that's obtained through observations and methodical experimentation, whereas forensics is something that indicates that we are pertaining to a legal inquiry. Therefore, we are using forensic science to mean we're applying science to a legal context, and specifically this is going to be in order to prove a claim or a counterclaim that's being presented in a court of law. So why do we need forensic science in the first place? I always find this to be really fascinating because people, I don't think, realize just how far back this idea goes. In order for us to have forensic science, we have to have law, because we're applying science to law. And I think most people believe that law started with Hammurabi's code, but actually it started even long before that. The Code of Ur-Nammu, which was uncovered in 1900 in what is present day Iraq. And you can see a picture of it here that literally written in stone was this criteria for making logical inferences, and this was intended to guide deliberation between competing arguments that were presented in trial. And we're talking about, 2047 to 2030 BCE time. So the idea of law and order and finding appropriate ways to be fair during arguments has been around forever. We've not always gotten it right. If we think about ancient law enforcement, and not even necessarily ancient, but historically speaking, we had, if the Salem witch trials is a great example, trial by drowning, trial by fire, trial by red hot iron, lots of medieval torture devices, if you will. So here are just a couple of examples from real life history. There on the right, you can see that trial by that hot iron rod where literally they were putting it in the fire and making you hold it. And if you could withstand that, and you didn't feel the pain, that meant you were innocent. And then we had these torture devices to try to get people to confess to things or to tell their truths. This bottom one right here is this pear of anguish, and you could put that in your mouth or wherever, and they would open this to torture you, basically. And so obviously things have progressed since then, and we really needed to make some changes to how we used to view this. But the idea is that trial and law have been around for as long as we know. So now we use more modern perspectives for this. We believe that the rights of individuals are constitutionally protected. Those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in fact, this is the only thing in the Constitution that is repeated verbatim twice. So in the Fifth Amendment, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the 14th Amendment, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So we obviously believe that this is very important, that you are given these rights and you can only have them taken away if we have a due process of law, which is why we need a good due process of law. There's always a presumption of innocence, and today the burden of proof is going to lie on the accuser. So if we're talking about a criminal case, that's going to be the government, and if we're talking about a civil case, that's going to be the accuser as well. And it has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and that was put in place really to ease the minds of the jurors when they are giving a conviction. So now that we have this foundational knowledge on really like the history behind all of these laws and stuff, we have to kind of jump into forensic science itself. Like, our job is to uncover facts that are necessary to determine the truth. So all we are looking for are facts and truth. And oftentimes this is going to involve indirect evidence that I'm going to talk about, but really all I can do as a forensic scientist is give specific facts. Yes or no, this bullet came from this firearm. Yes or no, this fingerprint was there. And that is indirect in the sense that it does not itself necessarily prove the innocence or guilt factor. It is one fact in showing and telling that story of what happened. And so that's our goal in forensic science, is to provide these facts and show and uncover that story of what happened. So there's a long evolution of things that have happened. Again, this is just to show you that forensics have been around longer than we had known the term. Okay, this started, autopsies were things that were being performed, centuries ago. And then we went from looking at for autopsies and performing these autopsies in Roman times and in Egyptians and things like that, to starting to use these basic foundations in the very first century here to acquit innocence of people. The first record of ways to determine causes of death was here written in China in the 13th century. And then as we continue on, we had some major milestones when it came to fingerprinting, toxicology, identifying poisons, and then those firearms and bullets. And then finally, we get to the most recent development, which is going to be our DNA analysis here. So I'm going to focus just on two major milestones here. The first one is fingerprinting. And I really just want to highlight that this has been around for so long. This is first used like 3,000 years ago in China. You can see this example here that they were using thumbprints and fingerprints to mark statues and sculptures that they had created. It was used then as binding for contracts, as signatures for contracts. So we've known for a very, very long time that there was something unique and special and identifying about these marks on our hands. The first time it was used to solve a crime was in the 1880s, and this was before we had any legal guidelines for it, but there was a fingerprint that was left on a whitewashed wall that they were able to link. They had two suspects for a crime, and they were able to link that fingerprint to the correct person. And then in the United States, we first adopted fingerprinting in 1904. So we've been using this here for quite a while ourselves. And I just want to mention a couple of interesting facts, because we are looking at fact versus fiction here today. And fingerprinting is huge. You see fingerprints that come up a lot in TV shows and podcasts. They use fingerprints for a lot of things. And so the general idea is that no two fingers at all have the exact same fingerprint. When this was first published, they predicted that there were going to be 64 billion possible variations of fingerprints. And we now know today that there are significantly more than that. If we just think about, we have 7 billion people on the planet, and each person has roughly 10 fingers. They each have about 10 fingerprints. So that we're already past the 64 billion mark, and there's just so much variety in there. What you're looking for are these minutia, these minute differences between the fingerprints, as we have in this image here, where we're literally comparing a fingerprint found at a crime scene to a fingerprint from a suspect. The very interesting thing about this is that we actually have no guidelines on matching. We have no requirement for a certain percentage of the fingerprint to match. We don't have any requirement for, if you only get a partial fingerprint, how much is enough to make a decision. This lies solely upon the opinion of the person evaluating the fingerprints. And specifically, it's actually going to be two people, because in order for this to get submitted into court, two people have to agree that these two fingerprints match. But the only criteria is that you have the experience appropriate for making that decision. So it's kind of an interesting thing that we rely so heavily upon something when we don't have any solid guidelines for analysis and evaluation happening. The other important thing about this is, once again, a fingerprint itself cannot prove guilt or innocence. A fingerprint can only prove the presence of that individual there or on that firearm. My fingerprints could be found at a crime scene, but that does not necessarily indicate that I committed the crime. My fingerprint could be found on a firearm, and if that firearm was what was used, in that crime, that's a much more direct link. But again, just to highlight that the key here for forensics, if we're looking at those facts, are that that's what we're uncovering, individual bits for the story itself that all have to come together to give us that final goal of guilt versus innocence. The other major milestone is going to be DNA, and this is the most recent major milestone, and it was a game changer for forensics. This happened in the 1980s that it was first introduced. The first case to use DNA to solve a crime was in 1986 in the UK, and for the first time they were able to link two crimes that were 3 years apart to each other and to the exact same perpetrator. And in fact, they were able to exonerate somebody who had actually confessed that did not commit the crime. It came to the United States a year later, and the big changes happened in 1990. In 1990, the FBI started the Combined DNA Index System project, where they were creating that database that we all hear about now to store those DNA samples. And then, of course, everybody learned about DNA in 1991 with the O.J. Simpson trial. It really put it as a major highlight. And then 1994 solidified that DNA Identification Act to provide the approval to start putting samples into that database that they set up 4 years earlier. So this is going to be my focus now, is really talking about what happens when you have a sample that is that has DNA. So we put that into our FBI database that I just talked about, that combined DNA index system. And there are certain laws that states and local territories have to follow. They determine which samples are taken and allowed to be put into that system based off of the laws that you have. And they control the amount of DNA that goes in. We're only allowed to take small little snippets of your DNA that don't contain any information about what you look like, can't contain any information about whether you could develop cancer or not. There's really no information that's there other than being able to link and identify you as a human being, okay? And again, there are only certain laboratories that are allowed to take and run these samples. It's highly regulated is the point of this. And I want to highlight one other thing. We can tell from your DNA if I have a sample that is your brother's or your sister's or your mom's or your dad's or your grandma's, we can connect those together. But there are a lot of states that don't allow this to happen. What that means is all I can do is put a sample into the system and search for an exact match. In Florida, Michigan, Texas, Utah, Virginia, Wisconsin, Wyoming, I'm also allowed to look for a relative match. So if you're not in the database, I could say, oh, okay, but you're related to this person. So if your brother is in there, that gives me a connection to you. But there are certain states, and I'm going to highlight Maryland and DC specifically, that prohibit you from being allowed to do that. It is all the rest of the states don't say, but those two specifically say that is not allowed, and that's going to be really important for what we're about to talk about here. Okay, there are other things that are successful that we can look at. We are now able to look at a different kind of DNA that we have. We can now sample botanic material and connect, pollen that's on your car to a crime scene, or the same thing, microbial samples, microbiomes or bacteria that are growing, we can connect because there's so much variety. If you're sitting in a chair right now, when you get up, if I took a swab of that chair, I could connect the bacteria on that chair to you, because those are the kinds of advancements we have now. But let's go back to just the general DNA. There are a couple of famous instances. The World Trade Center is probably a huge one that we use DNA for identification. One of the few planes that were allowed to fly the day after 9/11 was a plane that carried people to collect remains, and they've processed over 21,000 remains to identify those individuals. Also, if you like your serial killer podcasts, you've probably heard of John Wayne Gacy and Gary Leon Ridgway. They are both serial killers, and we have successfully identified the remains of their victims using DNA analysis at this point. Some other ways that we use DNA identification that are not so famous. A lot of war heroes have been identified. This is happening at the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory. That's their whole job, is to identify those sorts of remains. And then the UNT Health Science Center for Human Identification, right in Fort Worth, has the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, or NamUs, where they are identifying missing persons. So you can collect unidentified remains, or you can put in your samples and say, my relative is missing, and they try to link those two together. Now, for the fun part, the last thing, the main highlight is, now that we've talked about the acceptable pathways, we're going to talk about what's happening right now that is so brand new that we don't have any regulation for it. If you have heard, just a couple years ago, this was just the first in a series of many cold cases that have been solved. The Golden State Killer has not killed anybody that we know about in 40 years, but he was a killer in California, and there were no hits to the DNA matches in that database, no fingerprint matches, literally no leads for the last 40 years, and he is now in jail. The reason this happened is because of a company called Parabon Snapshot Advanced DNA Analysis. There is now a company that just opened in Houston that's going to do the exact same thing as them. What they do is they do DNA phenotyping, they do kinship inferences, and genetic genealogy. So what does that mean? Well, there's a website called GED Match, and if you have used any of those ancestry kits like 23andMe, you are given the option to upload your DNA into this website to try to find your ancestors. And it creates family trees for you. And the thing about that is the only way that can work is if you say, yes, I agree that my DNA can be searched to anybody else that's using this website. So it is a public database, and it can be cross-referenced with Ancestry.com, another very popular website. And they can use this to create family trees. So what they did was this DNA sample that they had left from all of these years ago, they took it and they put it into this database. They didn't get a match in the legal database, so they stuck it in here, and it created possible family trees. It had 10 possible family trees. And in the end, they were able to bring this down to 2 possible suspects. And then they were able to collect DNA from these 2 individuals. He had something that he threw in the trash, a beverage that he threw in a public trash can. So they were able to get a sample from a published trash can, because again, public domain, no regulation, no protection, into a public database. Those 2 matched together. He got arrested. He is now in jail. This caused them to be able to get a warrant to get an official DNA sample, by the way, because that's not official. Lots of additional cases have been solved, and I want to point out that, as you can see on the right-hand side here, we have cold cases solved in Washington and Maryland, those 2 places where I said that with the official pathway for DNA, they aren't allowed to do familial searches, and yet these people were found through these familial searching databases. In that year of 2018, when they found the Golden State Killer, they claimed 20 cases that they were able to solve that had not previously been solved. And that number is only growing. Lots of cold cases being solved. So why do we care about this? I just want to point this out because this affects you, whether you realize it or not. These public databases mean there are no regulations. The searching that's happening in there doesn't have to follow those protective guidelines that the traditional laboratories have to protect. Individuals are volunteering their information. They're saying, here, take my DNA and put it in there and let everybody search for it. There's no control of who, what, or for what purpose this is happening. So there is no control for the FBI. There's no local laws against it. There's no HIPAA protection here. The companies are selling your information. Most of them are saying that they will not share this without consent, but we have seen instances where a lot of people don't know what they're consenting to. And the idea is your DNA really yours? And the answer is yes, but not really, because you share your DNA with family members who use these companies and these sites. So if your aunt and your mom and your dad and your brother and your sister have all put their DNA in there, you might as well have too, all right? And this is just something that's really, the chief officer of MyHeritage, which is another one of these websites, said that within 2 or 3 years, 90% of Americans of European descent are going to be identifiable from their DNA, not necessarily even because they put it in there themselves, okay? And the reason that's important is because if we were to look at that database from the FBI, it's very heavily skewed to where American and European descent individuals are less likely to be in there. And here we are just volunteering for ourselves all of our information here. And so I just think that that's really cool and really powerful, and I want to share that knowledge with everybody. So very lastly, super quick, I do want to say that, as we know, forensics is super popular, and I'm going to switch gears to prep for this next section. This has had a big impact on the field of forensics. Okay, we have all of these TV shows, we have podcasts, we have books, and the sad part about it is most of these things are fantasy. These are not representative at all of what forensics is like in reality, but they make a massive impact on my job and the job of other people in this field because people expect it to be like what you see on TV. And I do want to take one pause to say, sometimes people get it right. 1887, Sherlock Holmes, this is a quote. I'm not going to read it here, but basically what he did was, in this book, he says that he found a test for blood, and it will identify blood and absolutely nothing else. And you know what? That's the way it works for real in forensics. So sometimes the two are going to overlap. Fiction will overlap with fact, but I'm not seeing something quite so accurate since 1887, unfortunately. And this causes, again, the public believes that these crime scenes are going to yield forensic evidence like what we see on TV or like what we hear in these podcasts. And the problem with that is we have very unrealistic expectations. We have juries that are deciding these cases, and they weigh very heavily on this forensic evidence. And so when they believe it's going to occur like what they see on TV, then it makes our job more difficult because it very rarely ever looks like it does on TV. So just a segue of something to think about when you're hearing the other side of this and you're hearing about forensics in the fiction. I gave you a little taste of what the reality of forensics is in these main areas, and I want you to think about the impact it could have when you're hearing about what it's like in fiction.
Hello, everyone. Thanks to Roxanne, who's given us a fascinating account of the history of forensic science and some current developments. And thanks, Roxanne, for the segue. I was planning on talking about that Sherlock Holmes story myself, including the blood test. So I'm going to take us back in time to some origins of detective fiction. I'm a 19th century Americanist by training, though I sometimes teach more recent crime fiction. I've been teaching a course on crime fiction for a while here at UTA. I want to discuss a few 19th century detective fiction texts like this one in terms of their representations of forensic science. Forensic evidence is a concern in detective fiction from the start. Early detective fiction often incorporates recent advances in forensic science. Forensic investigation is focused on identifying the perpetrator of a crime, but in 19th century fiction, this question is inevitably tied to the larger question of the criminal and criminality. Forensic evidence in detective fiction is often connected to assumptions about identity, especially criminal identity, and that's the connection I want to focus on. So Edgar Allan Poe's first story, featuring the Parisian detective Auguste Dupin, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, published in 1841, it's often cited as the earliest work of detective fiction. So, this is the first work of detective fiction. I mean, there's some arguments about that, but Poe wrote 3 of these stories featuring the detective Auguste Dupin. He called them tales of ratiocination, and that word, ratiocination suggests the use of logic and reason. It seems to cast the detective as a figure of supreme rationality. That's an idea that's embodied in the figure of Sherlock Holmes as well. And someone who is free from prejudice and superstition, who sees clearly in effect. Arguably, there's a parallel to claims made in this period for the figure of the scientist. So I just provided a little historical context here, just to show you how Poe's story was written, published at a time when modern police forces were being established in various cities, metropolitan cities around the world, to some extent anticipating developments that happened only after the story's publication. So for example, Scotland Yard was established 10 years before the story, 12 years before the story was published, but the first detective unit at Scotland Yard was only established after the story was published. And the same thing for the first detective unit created in the United States, which was in Boston in 1836. A big influence on this story was Eugène François Vidocq, who he's an interesting figure. He was actually a convicted criminal himself, but he became a police agent and he was really instrumental in organizing the Paris police force. He also established the first private detective agency in Paris. And his memoirs were published. Widely read memoirs published in 1828. Poe clearly was influenced by this. Dupin actually mentions him in the Murders in the Rue Morgue. He says, Vidocq was a good guesser and a persevering man, but without educated thought, he erred continually. And I think that's typical, actually, of the way Dupin and Sherlock Holmes respond to their predecessors. There seems to be the idea that for these brilliant, super rational detectives, there's only room for one at the top. So, all right. This is just an illustration of a later edition of Murders in the Rue Morgue. That story already contains several important conventions of the mystery genre. The most important one is the brilliant, hyper-rational detective and his more ordinary sidekick who narrates the story in the first person. He stands in for the reader as a kind of baffled observer, always a step behind the detective. Arthur Conan Doyle borrowed this structure wholesale for his stories of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Poe's story is also a locked room mystery. Two women have been brutally murdered in their apartment, and there is no apparent means of escape for the killer. There are various forms of evidence left at the crime scene, which Dupin examines thoroughly. There are also many witnesses, as this playful illustration shows. All of them report hearing a foreign voice speaking in a language they don't understand. The story suggests that the criminal is a foreigner, an idea that reappears often in 19th century crime fiction. Still another convention is that the story ends with Dupin explaining at length how he solved the mystery. So there is a tuft of hair left in the fingers of the victim, the crime scene, one of the victims. And Dupin asks the narrator, he asks him what he makes of it. The narrator says, Dupin, this hair is most unusual. This is no human hair. Dupin then produces a facsimile drawing of a handprint taken from the throat of one of the victims. Dark bruises and deep indentations of fingernails were left on her throat. And the narrator says again, this is the mark of no human hand. Dupin then produces a book of natural history and says, read now this passage from Cuvier, who was the great French natural historian before Charles Darwin and other later naturalists. It was a minute anatomical and generally descriptive account of the large fulvous orangutan of the East Indian Islands. So here the criminal is exposed as the most foreign, the most other, not human at all. Forensic science reveals criminal identity, placing the criminal beyond the limits of the human. So here's an illustration of the crime scene, of the crime itself, illustrated by Arthur Rackham in the 1930s. In fact, the story questions whether there's a crime at all in this case. The legal definition of murder requires an intention to commit a crime. The technical term is mens rea, a Latin phrase that translates literally as a guilty mind. Non-human animals are assumed to be incapable of having a criminal intention. So there is no crime in the story. There are no murders in the Rue Morgue. The story's end, the ape is captured and sold to a zoo. I want to move on to Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, another image of A Study in Scarlet. Roxanne already showed us one. As I've already mentioned, Doyle was obviously very strongly influenced by Poe's Dupin stories and often acknowledged the debt. He praised The Murders in the Rue Morgue as a perfect story that no writer could improve upon. Here's an image of A Study in Scarlet. This is a kind of humble publication, the start of Doyle's career of writing Holmes stories. It's published in a Christmas annual. He was paid very little for it, though eventually he became very wealthy through the popularity of Sherlock Holmes. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, and forensic science. There are a lot of connections here. Roxanne has already pointed out some. Arthur Conan Doyle himself had extensive medical training at the University of Edinburgh. It evidently included some elements of forensic science. He practiced as a physician for 10 years or so before publishing the Sherlock Holmes stories. Doyle often said that Holmes was modeled on his brilliant medical school professor, Joseph Bell, who was, according to Doyle anyway, famous among the students for his powers of observation and deduction. This is the test that Roxanne mentioned, the experiment that results in what Sherlock Holmes himself calls the Sherlock Holmes test. Can reveal even the most minute amount of blood at a crime scene. And I think this is an example, actually, of ways in which detective fiction could sometimes anticipate inventions that hadn't yet happened, that were over the horizon in forensic science. I don't think, Roxanne in the Q&A can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I don't think there was yet a blood test that could be as precise as the one that Holmes claims to have invented. On the other hand, Watson discovers that Holmes has never heard of the Copernican theory and doesn't care whether the Earth revolves around the sun or vice versa. He says, what does that have to do with my work? His interest in science is narrowly forensic, devoted to the investigation of crimes. And Holmes says about Dupin in the same story, Dupin was a very inferior fellow. Poe seemed to think he was special, but there's no basis for that. It's Holmes' claims. So in the next novel, The Sign of Four, published 3 years later, Holmes mentions that he has published monographs in various technical subjects in forensic science, including the different ashes left by 140 types of tobacco, complete with color plates, a point which is continually turning up in criminal trials, which seems a little surprising to me. But, and then another one on the effects of different trades on the hands of workers, with lithotypes of the hands of sailors, weavers, etc. Another monograph on the tracing of footsteps. That turns out to be essential forensic evidence in the Sign of Four. And he ends his account of the different studies that he's done by saying to Watson, but I weary you with my hobby. I think it's important to see that forensic science is a hobby, self-described by Sherlock Holmes, a sideline for the 19th century detective, calls himself a consulting detective. And in that way, forensic science for Dupin and for Holmes is very different than those recent TV shows that Roxanne was showing us, the kind of fantasies of what forensic science might be today, like Bones and CSI, etc. So, so here's an illustration of Holmes examining the crime scene in A Study in Scarlet, which he does at great length. It's an elaborate series of passages in the novel. You can see him with his iconic magnifying glass in this scene. He's looking at the German word for revenge, which has been written in blood on the wall. And he concludes that this is actually a red herring, a false clue. But Doyle was briefly a failed ophthalmologist, and I think it's interesting to think that the fascination with optical devices of various sorts in the Holmes stories may be connected to Doyle's own training. There's this idea that forensic investigation is a kind of visual science in Sherlock Holmes. So I want to move on to the next Holmes story, the short novel, The Sign of Four. For me, this is much more interesting than Study in Scarlet. The Sign of Four is another locked room mystery involving a murder in an English country house. Holmes examines the crime scene and finds various bits of evidence, including the murder weapon, the poison dart, and most notably footprints. Some of the footprints clearly belong to a man with a wooden leg, because, what Sherlock Holmes story doesn't need a man with a wooden leg? But the footprints of the killer are different. They're smaller and more slender. At a turning point in the novel, Holmes shares with Watson his analysis of the footprints of this other man, as he calls him. So Holmes says, wooden-legged men are not so common, but the other man must, I should think, be absolutely unique. And Watson says, that other man again. Holmes, I have no wish to make a mystery of him, to you anyway, but you must have formed your own opinion. Now do consider the data. Diminutive footmarks, toes never fettered by boots, naked feet, stone-headed wooden mace, great agility, small poison darts. What do you make of all this? Watson's conclusion, a savage. And like Dupin, Holmes provides a handy book, which he calls, it's a current, now being published, current publication, the very latest authority The Aborigines of the Andaman Islanders may perhaps claim the distinction of being the smallest race upon this earth. They are a fierce, morose, and intractable people. They're capable of forming most devoted friendships with people who are involved with crimes. And that's what he's thinking of. Mark that, Watson. Now then, listen to this. And I'm not going to read the rest of this horrible passage, except to note that it ends with the accusation that these people are criminals. He says, nice, amiable people, Watson. So this scene, as I mentioned, is very like the one in the Murders in the Morgue, in which Dupin examines the forensic evidence, the hair and the handprint, and refers to a scientific reference book, Cuvier's Natural History. Here in Holmes's case, it's presumably a book of 19th century anthropology and racial science. Identifying the perpetrator here involves a description of the criminal as foreign, exotic, other. It isn't animality that forensics reveals here, as in Murders in the Morgue, the racial otherness. At the same time, this novel is about the sins of the British Empire returning to England. It's the story of a murder committed in India and the colonies and a stolen treasure, which enriches an upper-class British family. But the crime haunts them and eventually leads to their violent deaths in their own English home. So the next couple of slides are just, I just wanted to quickly mention them. They're from a later story published after the turn of the century called The Adventures of the Norwood Builder, which revolves around a bloody fingerprint, a thumbprint left on the wall. On the cover of this American magazine, you can see Holmes looking at what here is a handprint, but it's actually a thumbprint. Holmes reveals that it's a false print, it's a fake that's left by a wax impression by someone who has faked his own death and is trying to frame someone for it. So the implication here is that fingerprints are not always reliable evidence in Holmes stories. Here's another image of the same thing. This is actually probably the most famous Sherlock Holmes illustrator, Sidney Paget, who illustrated many of his stories published in the Strand. So I want to discuss one last text, Mark Twain's short novel, Pudd'nhead Wilson. It's a strange, complicated story. It's Twain's most explosive, unsettling treatment of race and slavery. But it's also detective fiction of a sort, involving a murder, an investigation, and a criminal trial. In Twain's own account, the novel started out as a farcical story about the adventures of conjoined twins. This book cover emphasizes the P.T. Barnum-esque aspect of the story, the display of wonders and oddities, with Twain himself, Samuel Clemens, pictured gazing at a poster of the wonderful twins. Twain claims that as he wrote the story, he became more interested in subordinate characters, especially an enslaved woman named Roxy and her son Tom, and a small-town lawyer, David Wilson, nicknamed Pudd'nhead by his contemptuous fellow townsfolk. Wilson is sometimes taken as Twain's satirical dig at Sherlock Holmes, who had already become very popular by this time. According to Twain, the direction of the novel also changed because he began reading Francis Galton's newly published book, Fingerprints, published in 1892. Pudd'nhead Wilson was published in 1893. Galton, who Roxanne mentioned, was an important 19th century forensic scientist, among other pursuits. There were earlier uses of fingerprinting, but Galton's book is generally accepted as the first really systematic scientific treatment of the topic. It was hugely influential. London police began collecting fingerprints of criminal suspects within a few years of its publication, and fingerprints were introduced as evidence in criminal trials soon after. Galton was also a racial scientist who believed that science could reveal racial differences made visible in the body. He is said to have coined the word eugenics. He wrote about that topic extensively. He's an advocate for eugenics. In Fingerprints, he writes that he had great expectations that fingerprints would reveal the race, social class, and personality type of a person, not just identify them as an individual. He acknowledges, though, that the data he collected doesn't support these conclusions. It seems obvious today that someone's fingerprints don't say anything about their race or social class, but Galton was evidently disappointed. He even hedges at times in the book, suggesting that fingerprints can provide some clues for race and other social identities. For Galton, incriminating traces and their social meanings are displayed in the very body of the criminal. Pudd'nhead Wilson is widely credited with being the first work of fiction to incorporate the new technology of fingerprinting, the result of Twain's reading of Goldberg. It's a major plot element. Wilson, the unsuccessful lawyer, has a lot of time in his hands, and his hobby is to collect the fingerprints of his fellow citizens. In the revised version of the novel, the enslaved Roxy is pictured here, is nursemaid to the new baby of the slave-owning family of Driscolls, while also taking care of her own baby, Tom. Roxy and Tom are both able to pass for white, and she decides to switch the babies in order to give her own son the freedom and opportunity that comes with being the white heir. The image on this book cover is a cast photograph from the first theatrical production based on the novel, just a few years after the book was published in 1893. Here the actor playing Wilson is looking at glass slides containing the fingerprints he's taken of the two babies, just before they're switched. Roxy's son Tom grows up in an elite white slave-owning family. He is spoiled by wealth and privilege and corrupted in particular by having arbitrary power over others, including his own biological mother. He only learns that she's his mother in a late point in the novel. It's possible to read this novel as an anti-slavery, anti-racist text, though its message is troublingly ambiguous. Tom takes to drinking and gambling and acquires great debts. Because he hasn't yet inherited from his rich uncle, he attempts to pay off his debts by breaking into neighbors' houses and stealing their property. To disguise himself, he sometimes dresses as an old woman, and at other times wears blackface. Tom's racial identity has become strangely unstable, changeable. Twain's narrator remarks that Tom's birth status as a black slave is only a fiction of law and custom. Born into slavery, in effect passing for white, he then pretends to be black to commit crimes. Fingerprinting promises to sort out identity in the text. Tom murders his uncle in another burglary gone awry. Another character is charged for the crime, and Wilson becomes the defense attorney at the murder trial. During the trial, Wilson produces the fingerprints he has collected, enlarged so everyone can see them, revealing not only that Tom is the murderer, but also that Roxy exchanged the two babies, and that Tom is by law black and enslaved. So here's an excerpt from Wilson's speech, which actually goes on for several pages, introducing fingerprints at the trial. And I just wanted to read this to you. I beg the indulgence of the court while I make a few remarks in explanation of some evidence which I am about to introduce, and which I shall presently ask to be allowed to verify under oath on the witness stand. Every human being carries with him from his cradle to his grave certain physical marks which do not change their character, and by which he can always be identified, and that without shade of doubt or question. These marks are his signature, his physiological autograph, so to speak, and this autograph cannot be counterfeited, nor can he disguise it or hide it away, nor can it become illegible by the wear and mutations of time. His signature is not his face. Age can change that beyond recognition. It is not his hair, for that can fall out. It is not his height, for duplicates of that exist. It is not his form, for duplicates of that exist also. Whereas this signature is each man's very own. There is no duplicate of it among the swarming populations of the globe. This autograph consists of the delicate lines or corrugations with which nature marks the insides of the hands and soles of the feet. So Wilson's speech is a powerful expression of basic assumptions about fingerprints that have proved very lasting, I think. They are understood to be an unchanging, unalterable indicator of our unique identity as individuals, legible to anyone trained to read them. It's a very dramatic courtroom scene in the novel's climax. Through Wilson, Twain suggests that to see the fingerprints is to be immediately convinced. Townspeople who have always believed Wilson was a simpleton are converted more or less instantly by the apparently self-evident truth value of fingerprints. So in this illustration, Wilson is demanding that Tom create a new fingerprint to demonstrate that it matches the print on the murder weapon. Make the prints that will hang you, he says. Tom faints, which Wilson calls his confession, and Tom is arrested. So one last book cover from this novel. This one captures the idea that fingerprints are caught up in the question of racial difference in the novel, perceived oppositionally as black and white. The novel doesn't assert that fingerprints are an indicator of someone's race, and in that way it goes along with Francis Galton's admission that his data didn't support such a conclusion. But the novel is organized, or one could almost say contrived in such a way but Wilson's collection of fingerprints reveal which child is white and which child is black. You really have to put the words white and black in quotes in this novel. Tom, the shapeshifter who crosses racial boundaries, is exposed and pinned down by the power of the fingerprint. Fingerprinting in this text promises to police identity, to make identity visible and knowable. Twain leaves the reader feeling queasy at the end of the novel. Is Tom a murderer brought to justice or a fugitive slave who has been recaptured? In a strange twist, rather than being tried for murder, Tom is sold back into slavery at the end. Fingerprints in the novel promise to sort out identity and to restore characters to their proper place. But of course, the novel's revelations do nothing to change the conditions of slavery and inequality. So just to wrap up my talk, detective fiction is paired with forensic science from its origins in the 19th century. The scientific approach to forensic evidence in these fictions seems to offer the possibility of access to the truth free from bias or superstition. But as it's depicted in the fictions I've discussed, it turns out to be freighted with various assumptions about criminality and identity, about who criminals are, where they come from, and where they belong. So that's it from me. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Neil. And Roxanne, appreciate it very much. You know, I remember just a couple of years ago, I was talking to an acquaintance who worked in the district attorney's office, and we were talking about the CSI Effect, and he said, yes, you know, he said it's made my job so much more difficult. He said when I go before a jury now, I have to spend a certain amount of time explaining to them that we cannot comb the whole of the Walmart parking lot just looking for a single hair. It's just not possible. And so, you know, he just said it definitely is a real thing, and it really does influence the jurors. So, it was very interesting to hear what you had to, both of you had to say. Appreciate it. We do have a couple of questions. We got at least one in the queue from Peggy. She said, "I love how DNA can solve cold case files and innocent people, but how hard is it for innocent people to be exonerated? Do they need a team of lawyers to take their case?" So I don't know, Roxanne, maybe you want to take that?
So that's a great question. I love that question, and the simple answer is it's honestly not easy. This Innocence Project is one company, or is one nonprofit, and there are many others, but the Innocence Project's probably the most well-known, that take these cases on free of charge, but you have to get the case approved. So you submit the case and you try to get this approved. And they started recording in 1989, what I know of. This National Registry of Exoneration started in 1989. So I don't know a lot from before then, but there have been more than 25,000 people 2,800 people that have been exonerated since 1989, and about 500-ish of them were from DNA evidence. We usually only get about 20 a year that the DNA evidence is what is used to exonerate them. But the scary part of that is that my knowledge is limited, but the last I'd seen, about 70% of those wrongful convictions came from misidentification. So somebody who ID'd a person that was not the correct person. And even scarier, about 30% of those were from confessions, people confessing to crimes that they did not commit. And most of these are not like for fame or something like that. About 10% of the cases had to do with mental illness individuals and things. So there's a lot that's happening. Not a great thing to say for my field, but about 40 to 45% of those cases involved mistakes, forensic mistakes, or poor forensics, as I would say. And so a lot of work needs to be done on that for sure. And yes, it is expensive, unfortunately. And while there's a lot of groups trying really hard to advocate, it's just, I mean, it sounds like a lot, 500 people, woohoo, but since 1989, just doesn't feel that impressive. in my opinion.
Thank you. Other questions?
I always, I listen to forensic files lots of time when I'm in the car.
That's a good one. There are some that are real forensic files. Yeah. It is a good one.
Yeah, it's a Sirius XM, one of those stations, but they always make it sound like they find one fiber, like that matches, and I'm like, how in the world they find that one, like carpet fiber or something like that? So I really appreciate your presentation, because you're like, oh, not as easy as they make it sound like, So it must be painstakingly hard to really solve some of those. I mean, of course, they tell you the success stories, right? They don't tell you all the ones that are impossible, right?
Unsolved cases.
Right. We do have a question.
So here's a question. Yeah, this is for Neil. I wonder if you could comment on the apparent extent of Poe's, Doyle's, and Twain's respective faiths in science to overcome our assumptions about who commits a crime. Neil, I don't know if are you muted?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Unmuted. I think Doyle especially is somebody who has a great deal of faith in science, and his own training as a doctor, training in medical science, orients him towards that, I think. Poe is someone who's more skeptical, and I also think, this would be another talk, but ideas about science are changing over the 19th century. And, if you think of Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, published in 1818 at the beginning of the 19th century, in that text, the borders between science and other kinds of pursuits, religion or art, are not so clear yet. Science is kind of coming into being as a separate discourse with some real cultural power. And Poe is someone along the way in that. Like for him in his fiction, he's interested in dabbling in mathematics and in various sciences. He studies these problems. He unmasks famously a hoax in astronomy. Someone purported to have a telescope powerful enough to see people on the moon, and Poe unmasks that. So he's interested in science, but he's interested in what he can sort of do with it for his fiction. And Twain, Twain obviously really took to Francis Galton's book, Fingerprints. He's interested in reading about science. He was kind of, a very voracious reader himself. So, I think all of them in one way or another are interested in science, but science, the status of science is changing during the period in which they're writing.
Great. Charles has a question. Roxanne, do you think that in the future DNA testing will be able to get to 100% accuracy?
No, I don't. The systems that we have now, if you can get sufficient DNA, which we really only need about 18 cells worth of DNA in order to get a full DNA profile, that's a 1 in 21 trillion are the odds of that. So, multiple times the amount. What that means is, like, if I were to randomly walk up to somebody on the street and swab their DNA, the likelihood of them matching what I found at the crime scene is 1 in 21. I said million and I meant billion. 21 billion, meaning I'd have to go through 21 billion people before I would randomly find the match. And so if those two matched up together, it's basically a guarantee that that DNA came from that person. So the testing that we have right now is incredibly sensitive and very reliable and accurate. Really, what happens is more a matter of admissibility into court and whose DNA is able to be tested and whose is not. They try really hard to protect as much as possible your DNA, but that's kind of what they were saying, like in what I was saying with that, the genealogy sites and stuff, is if you agree to put your own DNA in there, at least today, there's no regulation on who's allowed to use that. And I promise you, I say that because I guarantee you that can't last much longer. That's going to be something that ends up going to the Supreme Court, and there's going to end up getting laws that regulate, law enforcement's use of those websites and things like that, for sure. But for today, there's not. And so it really is kind of an interesting thing. But no, I don't think that DNA is really ever going to be the end all be all because of the idea of the protection that you have for your DNA itself.
Great. Well, I think that's about all the time we have. So, Anne, I'll turn it back to you.
Hey. Thank you. Once again, we thank our speakers. Thank you so much for sharing the afternoon with us. We really wonderful presentations. Very exciting to learn of the work our own faculty are doing here at UTA. So, and thank the attendees. I thank you for being here today as well. Here is contact information if you'd like to know more about the programs in criminology and criminal justice or in the Department of English. There's the speaker's contact information. You can also contact us at CERTL, and there's our email and our website. The recordings will be posted there as well. And then this is our last event, so we thank you. It concludes our summer series. We will plan on something for next year. We're not sure if it will be in person or the same format as we did this year, so we're still planning that. We are right now just getting ready to start up the new semester, so we're excited to begin fall semester here at UTA. And so I'd like to thank you again. We will send out a feedback form, and please give us feedback on how we can improve our programs and in CERTL in general, or how we can also bring you more events like this and your reflections on the series that we presented this summer. So your friends at CERTL, we're here to help support faculty, and we're very happy again to have had our guest speakers today. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.